Hey guys, tonight we're finding out exactly why you couldn't handle medieval women. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If your image of a medieval woman comes from fairy tales, romantic paintings, or films where she spends her afternoons gazing from a castle window while waiting for a handsome knight to return home, history has some disappointing news. That version certainly existed in songs and poetry, but everyday life was considerably less glamorous and contained far more mud. The average medieval woman wasn't waiting for adventure. She was too busy making sure everyone made it to the next sunrise. Life in the Middle Ages rewarded one quality above all others: usefulness. Charm was pleasant, good looks were appreciated, but neither could milk a cow, repair a torn cloak, preserve enough food for winter, or stop the roof from leaking during 3 days of relentless rain. Medieval women learned these lessons early because they had little choice. Survival depended on competence, not convenience. From dawn until long after sunset, their work rarely stopped. Water had to be hauled from wells or streams. Fires had to be kept alive because relighting one could take considerable effort. Bread wasn't bought, it was baked. Clothes weren't replaced. They were repaired repeatedly until the fabric surrendered completely. Livestock needed feeding. Gardens demanded attention. Cheese had to be made. Ale had to be brewed, because drinking questionable water every day was an excellent way to become a historical footnote. By the time you were congratulating yourself for successfully putting on both boots, she had probably completed enough work to qualify for an entire modern productivity podcast. And it wasn't simply physical labour. A medieval woman often carried an astonishing amount of knowledge entirely in her memory. She knew when to sow grain, when to harvest herbs, how much flour remained in storage, which neighbour owned the wandering goat currently eating the vegetables, which child was developing a fever, and whether the smoked meat hanging above the hearth would last another month or only another week. There was no notebook, no calendar notification, no helpful message reminding her that winter was approaching. Winter had an unfortunate habit of reminding people itself. Even among the nobility, life was hardly one endless banquet. Noblewomen frequently supervised enormous estates while their husbands disappeared to fight wars, attend court, or pursue glory in distant lands. Someone still had to collect rents, oversee servants, settle disputes between tenants, inspect harvests, and make sure enough food reached everyone living on the estate. The castle didn't magically organise itself. Despite what fantasy stories occasionally suggest, castles were less like luxury hotels and more like oversized businesses that happened to have defensive walls. If something went wrong, hundreds of people could feel the consequences. This is where many modern assumptions begin to fall apart. Medieval women were not passive passengers in history. They were managers, planners, healers, negotiators, farmers, merchants, mothers, and problem solvers. Their responsibilities were rarely optional because there simply wasn't anyone else available to do them. The Middle Ages had a wonderfully efficient management philosophy. If you were capable of doing the job, congratulations. It was now your permanent job. Annual performance reviews were replaced with something much simpler: whether everyone survived the winter. By the end of this journey, you'll probably discover something unexpected. The difficult part about living with a medieval woman wouldn't have been her expectations. It would have been realizing she could meet every one of them herself. And she'd quietly notice that you couldn't. If you believe waking up before 7 in the morning is an impressive achievement, a medieval woman would probably have considered you halfway through your lunch break. The day often began long before sunrise. Without electric lights, people naturally followed the rhythm of daylight, but work couldn't always wait for the sun to appear. Fires needed attention before they died completely during the night. Animals expected feeding regardless of the weather. Bread dough had to be prepared hours before anyone planned to eat it. Water had to be fetched before the household became busy. There was no snooze button. The rooster was the snooze button. And he was famously terrible at customer service. For peasant women, the morning could begin with carrying heavy wooden buckets from a village well or nearby stream. Depending on where they lived, that might mean several trips every single day. Water was needed for drinking, cooking, washing, brewing ale, feeding livestock, and cleaning. Every drop reached the house because someone physically carried it there. Modern fitness influencers would probably market it as functional strength training. The medieval woman simply called it Tuesday. Once the water arrived, breakfast still wasn't ready. Grain had to be ground into flour if supplies were running low. Porridge needed cooking. Bread required baking or reheating. Cheese, onions, beans, or leftovers from the previous evening might complete the meal. Every ingredient represented hours of labour long before it reached the table. Even eating was the result of planning that stretched across entire seasons. Then came the endless maintenance that kept a household alive. Clothing needed patching, because buying new garments was expensive. Wool required spinning before it could become thread. Linen had to be washed by hand using water. Soap made from animal fat and ash, and an extraordinary amount of patience. Meanwhile, children were everywhere. Some were helping, some believed they were helping. History rarely tells us which group was larger. The work didn't stop inside the home. During planting and harvest seasons, women spent countless hours in the fields alongside men, sowing crops, gathering vegetables, collecting fruit, tending gardens, and caring for livestock. Chickens wandered underfoot. Geese loudly announced absolutely everything. Pigs displayed remarkable confidence, despite contributing almost nothing until much later in life. Every season brought different responsibilities. Spring demanded planting. Summer meant endless labour in growing fields. Autumn revolved around harvesting and preserving food before winter arrived. Winter itself became a careful balancing act of rationing supplies, while continuing countless indoor tasks. There were no quiet months, only different kinds of busy. Looking back, it's tempting to imagine medieval women as simply hard-working. That almost understates the reality. They weren't just hard-working. They were the engines that kept medieval society running, often before everyone else had even finished waking up. One of the quickest ways to misunderstand the Middle Ages is to imagine the husband making every decision, while his wife quietly nodded in agreement somewhere in the background. Reality was considerably less convenient. The medieval household functioned less like a dictatorship and more like a business that desperately needed two capable managers. If one stopped working, the entire operation could collapse with surprising speed. Unlike today, there was no insurance company, repair service, supermarket, or emergency delivery waiting to rescue a family from poor planning. Every household was essentially its own small enterprise, and medieval women were often its chief operating officers. A typical home had inventories to manage, food supplies to monitor, livestock to care for, tools to maintain, clothing to produce and repair, servants or labourers to supervise if the family could afford them, and children to raise into productive adults before they discovered creative new ways to accidentally injure themselves. Children, it turns out, have always been remarkably inventive. A capable wife knew exactly how much grain remained in storage without opening every sack. She understood how many eggs the hens usually produced each week, which cow gave the richest milk, how much firewood would survive a harsh winter, and whether it was time to slaughter a pig before feeding it became more expensive than keeping it alive. That wasn't trivia. It was economics. Modern households worry about monthly budgets. Medieval households worried about whether February would arrive before the cheese ran out. Money itself was only part of the equation. Much of medieval wealth existed in the form of land, animals, stored food, tools, cloth, and labour. Managing those resources required constant attention because nearly everything depended on the weather. A few weeks of heavy rain could ruin crops. A disease among livestock could erase years of careful planning. One failed harvest might affect an entire village. There wasn't much room for careless decisions, which is why practical intelligence earned enormous respect. In towns and cities, wives often worked directly alongside their husbands. Bakers' wives baked. Blacksmiths' wives kept accounts, negotiated with customers, purchased materials, and sometimes helped with production. Brewers' wives produced ale that neighbours bought regularly. Market stalls were frequently run by entire families, with women handling sales as confidently as anyone else. If her husband left for several weeks or months, the business usually didn't close. She simply continued running it. Among the nobility, the responsibilities became even larger. A lady of a great estate might oversee dozens of servants, hundreds of acres of farmland, rents from tenants, food stores, legal disputes, repairs to buildings, and correspondence with neighbouring lords. When her husband travelled to court or joined a military campaign, someone still had to ensure the estate remained profitable. That someone was usually her. So when people picture medieval women as standing quietly behind powerful men, history offers a gentle correction. Quite often, they were standing beside them. And every so often, they were standing in front, reminding everyone that somebody actually needed to keep the place running. Long before smartphones remembered birthdays, maps remembered directions, and search engines remembered absolutely everything else. Medieval women relied on a remarkable piece of technology, their memory, and it had to be good. There was no notebook hanging on the kitchen wall listing supplies for the week. No calendar reminding anyone that winter was only a few months away. No helpful recipe website explaining how to preserve meat or make cheese. Most ordinary women couldn't simply reach for a written manual, and even those who could read often lived in households where books were expensive enough to be treated almost like family treasures. Knowledge lived inside people's heads, especially hers. A medieval woman needed to remember which field had produced the best harvest the previous year, when certain herbs should be gathered, how long smoked meat would remain edible, which hens laid the most eggs, which neighbours could be trusted to return borrowed tools, and which ones mysteriously developed permanent ownership whenever they borrowed a shovel. Some traditions truly stand the test of time. She also remembered family histories, marriages, debts, promises, feast days, local customs, recipes, remedies, and enough practical information to keep an entire household alive through changing seasons. For many families, she became the household archive. If someone asked how much grain remained after last winter, she knew. If someone wondered whether enough wool had been spun to make new clothing before autumn, she knew. If someone questioned whether the family had already paid rent to the local lord, she definitely knew. Convenient memory loss was surprisingly difficult around people like that. Memory also meant experience. Every year added another collection of lessons about weather, crops, illnesses, childbirth, livestock, and human nature. Older women became respected not simply because they were older, but because decades of observation had transformed into practical wisdom. Young people often learned by watching them. Occasionally they also learned by ignoring them first. History suggests the second method was generally more painful. Many remedies, cooking techniques, and household skills were never written down at all. Mothers taught daughters. Grandmothers taught grandchildren. Neighbours exchanged advice during long hours of spinning wool or working together at harvest time. Entire generations passed knowledge forward through conversation and repetition. It wasn't a formal education, yet it was astonishingly effective. Today we become mildly uncomfortable if the internet disappears for 20 minutes. A medieval woman could lose an entire written library and still remember enough information to keep a family fed, clothed, and healthy, because the most valuable reference book was already stored in her mind. So if you arrived hoping to impress everyone by recalling a few interesting facts, you might discover an unfortunate truth. She wasn't competing in a trivia contest. She was carrying an encyclopedia, and unlike yours, hers had already been tested by real life. If you've ever imagined medieval women quietly agreeing with everything their husbands said, history would like to file a formal complaint. The Middle Ages were full of disagreements. Families argued over land, inheritance, livestock, marriage arrangements, borrowed tools, unpaid debts, wandering pigs, broken fences, and whose sheep had once again demonstrated an impressive talent for ignoring property boundaries. Since most people lived in tightly connected communities where everyone knew everyone else, simply storming away forever wasn't really an option. You would almost certainly see the same people tomorrow, and the day after that, probably at church. Arguments, therefore, had to accomplish something. A capable medieval woman quickly learned that shouting rarely solved practical problems. Persuasion, memory, patience, and occasionally a perfectly timed look of disappointment could prove far more effective. History never records the exact power of that look. Perhaps scribes were afraid to describe it. Many women became remarkably skilled negotiators because daily life demanded it. They bargained with merchants over prices, discussed rents with landlords, arranged marriages with neighbouring families, managed servants, settled disputes among children, and occasionally reminded husbands that buying another horse before repairing the barn might not represent the strongest financial strategy. Medieval bookkeeping often happened entirely inside someone's head. Ignoring the person who remembered every expense was generally considered unwise. Within villages, reputation mattered almost as much as money. A family known for honesty found it easier to borrow equipment, receive help during harvest, or arrange favourable marriages. A family known for constant quarrels often discovered that neighbours suddenly became very busy whenever assistance was needed. Strangely enough, this remains one of history's more enduring traditions. Women played a huge role in protecting that reputation. Every conversation at the village well, every market visit, every church gathering quietly strengthened or weakened a family's standing within the community. Words carried surprising weight. Once spoken, they travelled faster than anyone on horseback. In noble households, diplomacy became even more important. Ladies welcomed important guests, oversaw feasts, maintained relationships with neighbouring families, and helped preserve political alliances. A careless insult at dinner could create problems lasting years. A thoughtful conversation could prevent them entirely. Being gracious wasn't merely polite. It was practical politics. This is one reason medieval literature so often praises wisdom alongside beauty. Intelligence wasn't simply attractive, it was useful. The woman who could calm a disagreement before it became a feud might save her family from years of unnecessary conflict. Meanwhile, if you entered an argument armed with confidence but very few facts, you probably wouldn't enjoy the outcome. She remembered exactly who promised what, who failed to keep that promise, what happened the last 3 times someone suggested your brilliant idea, and why repeating it would almost certainly end the same way. In other words, long before modern debates included screenshots and receipts, she already had both. only they were stored in her memory instead of her phone. Modern dating often begins with carefully chosen photos, witty messages, and hoping nobody notices you accidentally liked a picture from 4 years ago. Medieval courtship was rather less forgiving. There was no opportunity to create an impressive first impression online because there was no online. There wasn't much room for pretending to be someone else either. Your neighbours had probably known you since childhood. Your family reputation followed you everywhere, and if you claimed to be hardworking, there were at least 20 people nearby who could immediately confirm whether that was true, or laugh. Mostly laugh. Finding a husband or wife wasn't simply about romance. Marriage was one of the most important economic decisions a family could make. A poor match could mean financial hardship, damaged alliances, or years of unnecessary conflict. A good one could strengthen 2 households for generations. Naturally, medieval women paid attention. Far more attention than many men probably hoped. A young woman wasn't just looking at whether a man was charming. Charm was pleasant, but charm couldn't repair a collapsed stable or produce enough grain after a disappointing harvest. She wanted evidence that he was dependable, skilled, respected, and capable of supporting a household through difficult years. Could he work? Could he keep his word? Did other people trust him? Did he waste money? Did he spend every evening in the alehouse explaining why tomorrow would definitely be more productive? These questions mattered far more than whether he had an impressive smile. Even among the nobility, where marriages were often arranged for political or economic reasons, women still judged character. A husband who was reckless, dishonest, or incapable of managing his responsibilities created enormous problems for everyone connected to him. Titles looked impressive. Competence aged much better. Courtship itself usually happened under careful supervision. Families met. Neighbours watched. Church communities noticed everything. Privacy, as we understand it today, barely existed. If 2 young people spent time together, someone almost certainly knew about it before sunset. Quite possibly before lunch. Villages had an extraordinary communication network. It was powered almost entirely by people minding everyone else's business. This also meant reputations were incredibly difficult to escape. If you were known as hardworking, generous, and reliable, that reputation opened doors. If you were known for laziness, broken promises, or avoiding responsibility, people remembered. They remembered for years, perhaps decades. By the time marriage finally arrived, neither side was entering completely blind. Families had quietly observed one another for a long time. Everyone had gathered opinions, compared stories, and formed judgments based on everyday behaviour rather than carefully rehearsed performances. Which brings us to an uncomfortable conclusion. If you think you could have charmed your way through medieval courtship with confidence alone, history suggests otherwise. Eventually, someone would ask what you actually contributed. And unlike today, saying you were still figuring things out was unlikely to inspire much confidence. One of the most persistent myths about the Middle Ages is that women spent their lives waiting for a brave knight to rescue them from one disaster after another. History politely disagrees. Most medieval women were far too busy solving their own problems to wait for someone riding in on horseback. In fact, if a knight did arrive unexpectedly, her first concern was probably whether she now had another hungry mouth to feed. Heroism is admirable, but it consumes a surprising amount of bread. The truth is that medieval life rarely paused because the men were away. Wars continued for months or even years. Pilgrimages took travellers across Europe. Merchants disappeared on long trading journeys. Some men never returned at all, whether through disease, battle, or simple bad luck. Life carried on regardless. Someone still had to milk the cows before sunrise. Someone still had to organise the harvest. Someone still had to collect rents, supervise workers, repair buildings, prepare food, and make certain the children reached adulthood with approximately the correct number of limbs. That someone was very often the woman of the house. Widowhood, while tragic, was not unusual during the Middle Ages. Disease, warfare, and dangerous working conditions meant many women suddenly found themselves responsible for farms, workshops, inns, or businesses. Remarkably, many succeeded. Medieval legal records are filled with widows signing contracts, managing property, hiring workers, lending money, and defending their rights in court. Some became wealthier after their husbands' deaths, because they controlled businesses they had already helped run for years. The paperwork simply caught up with reality. Even noble women regularly stepped into leadership roles whenever circumstances demanded it. While husbands served kings or fought overseas, wives governed estates that included villages, forests, mills, churches, and hundreds of tenants. Imagine managing an entire estate without electricity, telephones, vehicles, or spreadsheets. Now imagine doing it while everyone expected the harvest to succeed. No pressure. History also gives us examples of women organising defences during sieges. They supervised supplies, encouraged defenders, negotiated with attackers, and occasionally took direct command when no one else remained capable. It turns out stone walls don't defend themselves. Neither do frightened soldiers. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding is assuming strength always looked dramatic. Most medieval women never carried swords into battle or wore armour. They carried responsibility, every single day. They endured exhausting work, harsh winters, failed harvests, epidemics, and constant uncertainty without expecting applause. Survival itself became an achievement measured one ordinary day at a time. So if you picture yourself arriving in a medieval village expecting to impress everyone with tales of modern convenience, you may receive a rather different reaction. The woman standing beside the well has already survived 3 failed harvests, buried family members during an epidemic, rebuilt part of her home after a storm, and somehow still produced enough ale for tonight's supper. Compared to that, remembering to charge your phone suddenly feels like a fairly modest accomplishment. One of the easiest mistakes to make when imagining the Middle Ages is assuming that because many women received little formal education, they lacked knowledge. Formal education and practical intelligence, however, are very different things. A university scholar might debate philosophy and Latin for hours. A medieval woman knew which cow was about to become ill simply by watching it walk across the yard. One of these skills was considerably more useful before breakfast. Knowledge in medieval society wasn't always written down. In fact, much of the most valuable information never appeared in books at all. It passed from mothers to daughters, neighbours to neighbours, and grandmothers to grandchildren through years of observation and experience. How long should cheese age before eating? Which herbs helped calm a fever? How could grain be stored without attracting mice? When should fruit be picked before the weather turned? Which family secretly watered down their ale before selling it at market? People remembered, especially the women. They became living libraries of practical survival. Need help delivering a calf? She probably knew someone. Need to preserve enough vegetables to survive until spring? She already had a method. Need advice on raising 6 children in a house with 1 room and absolutely no privacy? She might simply laugh. Not because it was funny, because she'd already done it. Modern culture has given us a curious idea about medieval marriage. The husband swings a sword, the wife waits patiently at home, and together they somehow live happily ever after. History, once again, has other plans. For most medieval couples, marriage wasn't the ending of a love story. It was the beginning of a business partnership. The moment a couple married, their list of responsibilities expanded dramatically. There were fields to cultivate, animals to care for, tools to maintain, children to raise, taxes to pay, food to preserve, and enough daily problems to ensure nobody had time to wonder whether life needed more excitement. Life was already exciting enough, usually in the wrong ways. A successful marriage depended on both people understanding their roles and trusting one another's abilities. Medieval husbands often handled heavy agricultural work, construction, long-distance trade, or military obligations. Their wives managed countless responsibilities that were every bit as important, many of which continued whether the husband was home or not. Neither role worked particularly well without the other. This wasn't always about romance. It was about survival. The strongest couples were often those who understood each other's strengths. If one person excelled at managing money, they handled the accounts. If another understood livestock better than anyone else, they made those decisions. Practical ability mattered far more than wounded pride. The harvest had very little interest in winning arguments. It simply wanted to know whether someone had planted the wheat on time. Many marriages also involved long periods of separation. Crusades, wars, pilgrimages, royal service, and trade could keep husbands away for months or years. During those absences, wives became the household's unquestioned managers. Interestingly, very few medieval records describe villages collapsing because the men had left. The women simply continued working. Letters from the period reveal husbands frequently asking their wives to oversee finances, negotiate purchases, collect rents, or settle disputes while they were away. They weren't writing because they had no other option. They were writing because they trusted them. That trust had usually been earned over many years. Marriage also meant sharing hardships. Failed harvests, disease, floods, and famine affected entire families. Neither husband nor wife could solve these disasters alone. Survival depended on cooperation far more than authority. Perhaps that is why medieval writers often praised qualities like loyalty, wisdom, patience, and diligence above beauty or wealth. Attractive people existed in every generation. Reliable people were much harder to find. If you picture yourself arriving in a medieval village hoping to impress everyone by announcing that you're the man of the house, you might receive polite smiles. Then someone would probably hand you a shovel. Not because they doubted your confidence, because confidence was free. The potatoes, unfortunately, were not. And your wife had already been waiting long enough for you to start digging. If there was one thing medieval women valued above almost everything else, it was reliability. Not promises, not grand speeches. Certainly not someone explaining how they were about to become successful once the stars aligned, the weather improved, and they finally felt motivated. Results mattered. In medieval society, almost everyone depended on someone else. A farmer depended on the blacksmith. The blacksmith depended on the charcoal burner. The miller depended on the harvest. Families depended on one another. And wives depended on husbands who actually followed through. If a man promised to repair the barn before autumn, everyone quietly expected the barn to be repaired before autumn. Not during autumn. Definitely not after the first snowfall. The weather had an unfortunate habit of ignoring excuses. This constant pressure created a culture where reputation meant everything. A hard-working man became known throughout the village. So did a lazy one. Neither reputation stayed secret for very long. Villages were surprisingly efficient information networks. You might tell one neighbour you plan to fix the fence tomorrow. By sunset, 3 other neighbours were already wondering why it hadn't happened today. For medieval women, choosing a husband, or continuing to respect one, often depended on these everyday habits. Did he finish what he started? Could people trust his word? Did he remain calm when things went wrong? Or did he suddenly become fascinated by disappearing into the alehouse until the problem solved itself? History suggests the second strategy produced mixed results. The same standards applied inside the household. Respect wasn't automatically granted because someone happened to be the husband. Medieval literature, religious writings, and household advice repeatedly encouraged men to lead through responsibility, fairness, and diligence rather than arrogance. Authority without competence rarely impressed anyone, especially someone who had already completed half the day's work before sunrise. Women noticed consistency, not just on special occasions. Every day, a husband who quietly worked beside his family, helped secure enough food for winter, honoured his agreements, and treated others fairly built something far more valuable than popularity. He built trust. Trust allowed households to survive difficult years. It kept marriages stable during long absences. It allowed wives to manage estates with confidence while husbands travelled, knowing both shared the same goals. Without trust, everything became harder, even simple tasks. Perhaps this explains why medieval stories often celebrate ordinary virtues instead of dramatic heroics. Courage on a battlefield was admirable. Coming home and repairing the leaking roof before the next storm was equally admirable. One simply received fewer songs. So if you imagine arriving in a medieval village, hoping everyone will admire your confidence, your fashionable clothes, or your ability to explain why something wasn't technically your fault, you may be disappointed. The woman watching from across the yard has exactly one question. Can people rely on you? If the answer is yes, you've made an excellent first impression. If the answer is no, she probably figured that out long before you did. One of the biggest mistakes you can make is assuming that kindness and toughness cannot exist in the same person. The average medieval woman had to possess both. She might spend the morning comforting a frightened child, the afternoon helping an elderly neighbour whose husband had fallen ill, and the evening telling a fully grown man exactly why his latest decision was spectacularly foolish. Life demanded flexibility. The Middle Ages were not gentle. Disease arrived without warning. Harvests failed. Winters seemed determined to last forever. Children often died young. Families lost parents, siblings, and friends far more often than people today can easily imagine. Grief was familiar. Giving up was not an option. That constant hardship produced remarkable resilience. Medieval women learned very early that waiting for perfect circumstances was a luxury nobody could afford. If something needed doing, it was done. If disaster struck, people adapted because there was rarely another choice. Complaining consumed valuable time. The chickens, unfortunately, refused to care about your emotional journey. This resilience could sometimes appear harsh to modern eyes. Medieval mothers expected children to contribute from a young age. Teenagers worked alongside adults. Daughters learned household responsibilities years before they became wives themselves. Childhood certainly existed. It was simply much busier. The same practical attitude extended to relationships. A woman whose husband repeatedly made poor decisions could find herself carrying the consequences for years afterward. Every foolish purchase, every unnecessary argument, every neglected repair eventually landed on someone else's shoulders. Quite often, hers. It should not surprise us that medieval women developed little patience for avoidable stupidity. History is filled with examples of women warning husbands against reckless decisions, encouraging caution before risky ventures, and urging families to prepare for difficult seasons. Sometimes those warnings were followed. Sometimes they were ignored. The records suggest that ignoring them had an unfortunate tendency to become educational. Even noble women displayed this determination. Queens, countesses, and ladies of great estates negotiated with kings. confronted rebellious nobles, defended family interests, and protected their children with astonishing persistence. They understood that hesitation could be interpreted as weakness. Confidence was not reserved for men, neither was courage. Perhaps this is why so many medieval chronicles quietly admire women who remained calm during catastrophe. While panic spread through entire communities, they continued organizing food, caring for the sick, directing servants, comforting frightened children, and making practical decisions. Someone had to keep thinking clearly. Usually someone did. So if you imagine yourself arriving in the Middle Ages hoping to impress everyone with confidence alone, remember one small detail. The woman standing beside you has survived famine, disease, political chaos, failed harvests, and probably 3 neighbours convinced they knew better than everyone else. You would not be the first person she had quietly decided needed more work and fewer opinions. It's easy to imagine that medieval women only held influence inside their own homes. History quietly disagrees. Across medieval Europe, countless women shaped politics, managed kingdoms, negotiated peace, financed armies, advised rulers, and occasionally frightened powerful men who were perfectly comfortable charging into battle, but suddenly became much less confident when confronted by a determined queen. Armour, it seems, offered very little protection against good judgment. Even ordinary women exercised influence far beyond their front doors. Village elders frequently consulted experienced wives and widows because they understood local families, remembered old agreements, and knew who could be trusted. Their opinions carried weight not because a law demanded it, but because they had earned respect through decades of practical wisdom. Experience has always been difficult to argue with. At the highest levels of society, noble women became indispensable. While kings travelled across their realms or fought distant wars, queens often governed in their absence. They signed official documents, heard legal disputes, supervised royal finances, welcomed foreign ambassadors, and ensured the machinery of government continued operating. The kingdom didn't simply pause because the king was away. Someone still had to keep everything from falling apart. Many noble women also became skilled diplomats. Marriage connected powerful families across Europe, meaning queens and princesses often communicated with rulers in several different kingdoms. They carried messages, eased tensions, negotiated alliances, and sometimes prevented wars before swords ever left their scabbards. That required intelligence and an extraordinary amount of patience. Imagine trying to convince 2 medieval kings not to fight each other. Now imagine succeeding. Some women even became military leaders when circumstances demanded it. During sieges, they organised defences, rationed supplies, inspired exhausted defenders, and negotiated with attacking armies. Medieval chronicles occasionally describe women standing on castle walls directing preparations, while everyone else wondered how much longer they could hold out. Apparently, leadership looks remarkably convincing when everyone is depending on you. What makes these stories remarkable is not that women occasionally held authority. It's that many people around them accepted it when competence was obvious. The Middle Ages could be deeply traditional, but necessity had a habit of ignoring tradition. If the most capable person available happened to be a woman, kingdoms, castles, and villages often relied upon her regardless. Survival rarely cared about appearances. Looking back, we sometimes underestimate medieval women because they rarely wrote books celebrating themselves. Their achievements are scattered across legal records, royal letters, monastery chronicles, and estate accounts rather than dramatic autobiographies. Yet those quiet documents tell an unmistakable story. Again and again, when kingdoms faced uncertainty, families faced disaster, or communities needed steady leadership, women stepped forward because someone had to. So if you believe medieval women spent history waiting for permission to matter, you're asking the wrong question. The better question is this: how many times did history succeed only because they never waited at all? By now, you've probably noticed a pattern. The further we move away from fairy tales and closer to historical records, the tougher medieval women become. This surprises many people because history has a habit of simplifying the past. Over the centuries, countless stories reduced medieval women to two familiar roles. They were either helpless maidens waiting to be rescued, or elegant noble ladies spending their days sewing by the window while composing poetry. Neither picture survives contact with reality. The overwhelming majority of medieval women were neither. They were simply busy. Part of the misunderstanding comes from the fact that medieval society certainly gave men and women different responsibilities. Men generally fought wars, ploughed heavy fields, and performed physically demanding labour. Women managed households, produced clothing, preserved food, raised children, cared for livestock, assisted with harvests, brewed ale, worked in family businesses, and kept communities functioning. Different jobs, not easier ones. In fact, historians often point out that the average medieval woman probably worked just as many hours as the average man, sometimes more. Especially during harvest season, when sleeping became something people vaguely remembered doing. Modern audiences also underestimate how physically demanding everyday life really was. Grinding grain, washing clothes by hand, carrying water, chopping vegetables, stirring enormous cooking pots over open fires, spinning wool, weaving cloth, gathering firewood, tending gardens, and preserving food required constant movement. There was no gym membership. Life itself was the workout. Perhaps that explains why nobody needed motivational videos explaining how to stay active. Surviving until winter was generally motivation enough. Another myth suggests medieval women had no influence because they rarely appeared in famous battles or political speeches. But history isn't only shaped by people standing on battlefields. It is shaped by the people making sure everyone else survives long enough to reach them. Every successful harvest, every child raised into adulthood, every household that survived another difficult winter, every business that continued operating while its owner travelled, every estate that remained prosperous despite years of war. Behind countless achievements stood women whose names never appeared in grand chronicles. Not because they lacked importance, because medieval writers often assumed everyone already understood how essential their work was. Ironically, later generations forgot. So when someone claims medieval women lived quiet, passive lives, they're usually describing an imaginary Middle Ages that never truly existed. The real women of medieval Europe were practical, intelligent, resilient, and astonishingly capable. Which brings us to one final uncomfortable thought. If you somehow found yourself transported back 800 years, you probably wouldn't spend much time teaching a medieval woman how to survive. She would almost certainly spend the first week teaching you. Assuming, of course, you managed not to lose the family's only goat before breakfast. After everything we've seen tonight, one conclusion becomes difficult to avoid. You probably wouldn't struggle in the Middle Ages because of the castles, or the plague, or even the complete absence of indoor plumbing, which deserves its own moment of silence. You would struggle because you'd be surrounded by people whose everyday abilities had been sharpened by necessity from the moment they could walk. Especially the women. For the average medieval woman, competence wasn't an impressive personality trait. It was the minimum requirement for getting through another week. She understood seasons without checking a weather app. She knew how to preserve food that had to last for months, not days. She could repair clothing instead of replacing it, recognize the first signs of illness before it became dangerous, organize an entire household with almost no written records, and make hundreds of practical decisions every single day without expecting praise. If something broke, she fixed it. If someone became sick, she adapted. If winter arrived earlier than expected, she found a way to stretch the family's supplies, not because she enjoyed impossible challenges, because there wasn't another option. Modern life has quietly removed many of these responsibilities from our daily routines. We buy bread instead of baking it. We replace clothes instead of repairing them. We call specialists instead of becoming one ourselves. Need water? Turn a tap. Need light? Flip a switch. Need dinner? Someone might deliver it directly to your front door. A medieval woman would probably consider this astonishing. She might also wonder why you're still tired. That isn't meant as criticism. It's simply a reminder that people become products of the worlds they live in. The Middle Ages demanded resilience. Our world demands very different skills. Neither makes people better or worse, only different. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson hidden beneath all the myths. Medieval women weren't extraordinary because they possessed superhuman abilities. They became extraordinary because ordinary life required extraordinary effort. Generation after generation, they adapted to challenges most of us will thankfully never face. Their strength wasn't loud, it was constant. Their courage wasn't always recorded in chronicles. It appeared in thousands of ordinary mornings that began before sunrise and ended long after darkness fell. History rarely remembers every loaf of bread baked, every child comforted, every roof repaired, every harvest saved, or every difficult decision made around a small wooden table. Yet those quiet victories built medieval civilization just as surely as kings built castles. So the next time someone jokes that life in the Middle Ages was simple, remember the women who lived it. Not because they were fearless, not because they never grew tired, but because every single day they did what needed to be done anyway. And if we're being completely honest, after spending 1 week trying to keep up with them, you'd probably be asking whether there was perhaps another century available. Roman crossing the Rhine for the first time, the landscape itself seemed to announce that they had entered another world. The tidy vineyards that stretched across Italy and Gaul disappeared, replaced by endless forests, misty marshes, and rolling fields of grain. There were no hills covered in grapevines, no marble villas with wine presses, and no taverns boasting the latest vintage from Campania. Instead, smoke drifted from timber villages where families brewed something entirely different. The aroma hanging in the air was not fermented grapes, but warm barley, oats and malt, slowly transforming into ale. For the Romans, wine was more than a beverage. It represented civilization itself. Since childhood, Roman citizens drank watered wine with meals, offered it to the gods during religious ceremonies, and celebrated victories with generous cups. The vineyard was considered a mark of prosperity, refinement, and good order. To many Roman writers, people who did not cultivate grapes appeared to be missing one of the defining features of civilized life. Yet beyond the frontier, the Germanic tribes had reached a different conclusion. Their colder climate made vineyards unreliable, but fields of barley, wheat, rye, and oats flourished. Rather than forcing nature to imitate the Mediterranean, they embraced what the land offered. Grain became bread, porridge, and, perhaps most importantly, beer. When Julius Caesar described the tribes during his Gallic campaigns, he noted that many relied little on imported luxuries. They valued livestock, hunting, and simple agriculture, while wine remained scarce. Later, Tacitus observed that Germanic peoples brewed intoxicating drinks from barley or wheat, producing a beverage that he remarked resembled wine, though only from a Roman point of view. It was not an imitation of wine at all. It was its own proud tradition. The first Roman soldiers who accepted a wooden cup of Germanic ale probably experienced mixed emotions. The drink was cloudier than the carefully filtered wines of Italy. It often carried hints of herbs, smoke, and freshly baked bread. Depending on the brewer, one batch could taste entirely different from the next. Consistency was not the goal. Nourishment and hospitality were. Roman officers often looked down upon beer as the drink of barbarians, yet necessity had a way of softening prejudice. Garrisons stationed along the Rhine sometimes found local ale easier to obtain than expensive shipments of wine arriving from distant provinces. A legionary who had spent months patrolling rain-soaked forests might quietly admit that a warm cup of fresh ale after a cold day's march was not the worst invention beyond Rome's borders. This difference in drink reflected something much larger than personal taste. It revealed two civilizations shaped by completely different environments. Rome trusted vineyards, trade routes, and centuries of agricultural tradition. The Germanic tribes trusted forests, grain fields, and the rhythms of northern seasons. Neither culture believed its own customs unusual. Each simply assumed that its way was the natural one. That simple wooden cup of beer would become one of the earliest symbols of the cultural divide between Rome and the peoples beyond the Rhine, a divide that fascinated Roman writers for centuries and would shape countless encounters between empire and tribe. If a Roman merchant asked a Germanic brewer where the vineyards were, the answer would probably have been a puzzled stare, followed by a gesture toward a field of barley. Why grow grapes that struggled against long winters when sturdy grains flourished with almost insulting ease? The Germanic tribes did not see beer as a substitute for wine. It was simply the drink their land had always provided. Brewing began long before the first cup was poured. After the grain harvest, barley was the favourite choice in many regions, though wheat, oats, rye, and even mixtures of several grains could all find their way into the brewing vat. The grain was soaked in water until it began to sprout. This process, known today as malting, unlocked natural sugars hidden inside each kernel. Once the tiny shoots appeared, the grain was carefully dried over a fire or in the open air, depending on the season. The drying process often gave the finished ale a faint smoky flavour. Modern breweries spend enormous effort producing identical batches every time. Germanic brewers would likely have found this obsession amusing. Every harvest differed, every fire burned differently, every season left its own signature on the grain. Variety was expected rather than avoided. The malted grain was then crushed using stone querns before being mixed with hot water inside large wooden tubs or sturdy clay vessels. As the mixture rested, its sugars dissolved into the liquid, creating a sweet mash. The spent grain could still feed livestock, ensuring that very little of the harvest went to waste. Unlike later medieval brewers, many Germanic tribes did not rely heavily on hops, which only became widespread centuries afterward. Instead, local herbs supplied bitterness and aroma. Bog myrtle, yarrow, mugwort, juniper berries, spruce tips, heather, and other wild plants varied from region to region. Every village knew which herbs grew best nearby, making each community's ale slightly different from its neighbours. Fermentation itself remained something of a mystery. Brewers understood that if the sweet liquid rested under the right conditions, it would transform into an intoxicating drink. They did not know about yeast cells, but generations of experience taught them how to encourage the process. Wild yeast floating through the air or lingering inside well-used brewing vessels performed the work naturally. Brewing was usually a household responsibility rather than a profession. Women often oversaw the process, just as they baked bread and prepared meals. A successful brewer earned respect within the community because poor beer wasted valuable grain, while good beer nourished both family and guests. Ale was often safer to drink than stagnant water, especially after the boiling process eliminated many harmful impurities. To Roman observers, these rustic breweries seemed remarkably simple compared to the organised wine estates of Italy. There were no elegant presses carved from stone, no vast underground cellars lined with amphorae, and no merchants arguing over vintages. Yet behind these modest wooden buildings stood centuries of practical knowledge perfectly suited to northern Europe. The Romans admired engineering. The Germanic tribes mastered adaptation. Their beer was proof that civilization could take very different forms, even when built around something as ordinary as a humble field of barley. Once the beer was brewed, its true purpose was only beginning. Germanic ale was not meant to sit quietly in storage while aging into an expensive vintage. It was meant to be shared. The centre of that sharing was the Great Hall, a timber building that served as dining room, council chamber, courtroom, and, when necessary, recruiting office for the next war band. To Roman visitors, these smoky halls looked rough around the edges. To the tribes who gathered inside them, they were the beating heart of society. As evening settled over the village, people drifted toward the hall carrying benches, baskets of bread, roasted meat, smoked fish, cheese, and wooden drinking cups. Fires crackled in the central hearth while smoke escaped through openings in the roof, although not all of it seemed particularly eager to leave. Spending an evening inside often meant accepting that you would smell like a campfire until your next bath, which, depending on the season, might not be tomorrow. The chieftain occupied the seat of honour, but his position depended on more than inherited authority. A successful leader was expected to be generous. He distributed food, gifts, weapons, and above all, drink. The ability to provide abundant ale demonstrated that his household was prosperous enough to support loyal followers. A stingy chief risked seeing ambitious warriors drift toward a rival who filled cups more freely. Roman authors recognized this relationship between hospitality and power. Tacitus observed that Germanic leaders maintained influence through personal loyalty rather than the rigid bureaucracies familiar to Rome. Feasts played a vital role in reinforcing these bonds. Every shared cup reminded warriors that their fortunes were tied to the generosity of their leader. Conversation flowed as steadily as the ale. Elders recounted family histories stretching back generations. Hunters described successful expeditions into the forests. Traders returned with stories of distant peoples and strange customs. Young warriors listened carefully, learning the values expected of them long before they ever stood in battle. Poets and singers also held an honoured place. Long before histories were written down, heroic deeds survived through memory and performance. Songs celebrated victories, mourned fallen companions, and preserved the reputations of ancestors whose names might otherwise have vanished. The rhythm of drinking and storytelling reinforced one another, with each toast inviting another tale from the past. Disagreements certainly occurred. Roman writers occasionally remarked that important matters were discussed during feasts, partly because men spoke more openly after drinking. Tacitus even noted that tribes sometimes debated significant political questions while intoxicated, then revisited those decisions sober the following day. The first discussion encouraged honesty, while the second allowed careful judgment. It was an unusual system from a Roman perspective, yet not entirely without logic. Women also participated in many gatherings, though customs varied between tribes. They served food and drink, cared for guests, and in some communities offered respected opinions during important discussions. Roman observers frequently commented on the comparatively high regard many Germanic societies showed toward women, especially within the household. To a Roman senator, political authority belonged in marble forums beneath towering temples. Beyond the Rhine, It often rested inside a wooden hall where firelight flickered across carved beams. Stories echoed through smoky air, and friendships were measured one overflowing cup of ale at a time. As Roman armies pushed deeper into Germania and merchants ventured beyond the frontier, they returned with stories that fascinated audiences back home. They spoke of towering forests, fierce warriors, and villages where beer flowed more freely than wine ever could. Roman writers eagerly recorded these observations, although they often viewed them through the comfortable lens of their own culture. To many of them, beer was not simply a different drink. It was evidence that these northern peoples lived according to entirely different rules. One of the most influential voices was Tacitus, writing in the late 1st century. His work, Germania, remains one of the most valuable Roman accounts of the tribes beyond the Rhine. He described their beverage as one made from barley or wheat that had been fermented into something resembling wine. It was a polite description, though one can almost imagine a Roman reader raising an eyebrow at the comparison. To someone raised on Italian vintages, ale seemed coarse and unfamiliar. Tacitus also remarked that the Germanic tribes were enthusiastic drinkers. According to him, they often spent entire days and nights at feasts, with drinking continuing until exhaustion or sleep finally brought the gathering to an end. Yet his account carried an interesting contradiction. While he criticised their fondness for alcohol, he also praised many of the same people for qualities that Romans admired: bravery, loyalty, honesty, and a surprising lack of greed. Julius Caesar, writing nearly a century earlier, painted a somewhat different picture. During his campaigns in Gaul, he claimed that several Germanic groups deliberately limited their access to imported wine. He believed they feared luxury would weaken discipline and soften the character of their warriors. Whether this policy existed everywhere is uncertain, but it reveals something important. Even Roman observers recognized that many tribes valued toughness over comfort. Archaeology has complicated these ancient descriptions. Excavations across Germany, Denmark, and neighbouring regions have uncovered drinking vessels ranging from simple wooden cups to beautifully crafted horns decorated with bronze and silver. Some elite graves even contained imported Roman glassware alongside local drinking equipment. Clearly, the tribes appreciated fine craftsmanship, whether it came from their own artisans or Roman traders. Roman writers also tended to exaggerate when describing drunkenness. Ancient authors often emphasized dramatic details to entertain readers or reinforce stereotypes. Describing barbarians as excessive drinkers fit neatly into the Roman belief that they themselves represented moderation and order. The reality was almost certainly more balanced. Beer accompanied daily meals, seasonal festivals, religious ceremonies, and political gatherings. It was woven into ordinary life, not simply an excuse for endless revelry. Ironically, Roman society was hardly free from excessive drinking. Banquets in wealthy households could stretch late into the night, with guests reclining on couches while servants constantly refilled wine cups. The difference was presentation. Romans diluted their wine with water and surrounded drinking with elaborate etiquette, convincing themselves that refinement somehow separated them from the tribes across the Rhine. In truth, both cultures enjoyed gathering around a drink. One preferred wine poured from elegant amphorae. The other favoured fresh ale served from wooden barrels. Roman authors noticed the differences immediately, but beneath those differences lay something surprisingly familiar: the simple human pleasure of sharing stories, strengthening friendships, and ending the day with a full cup in hand. As the frontier between Rome and Germania became busier with merchants, diplomats, and soldiers, another traveller quietly crossed the Rhine alongside them: wine. Amphorae filled with red and white vintages from Italy, Gaul, and Hispania found their way into Germanic settlements, sometimes travelling hundreds of miles by river and wagon. To the Romans, these shipments carried one of civilization's greatest achievements. To the Germanic tribes, they were something altogether different, a rare curiosity rather than a replacement for the drink they already loved. Roman wine was expensive beyond the frontier. Every amphora had to survive a long journey through forests, rivers, changing seasons, and occasionally ambitious bandits who appreciated free refreshments. By the time the wine reached a tribal chieftain, its value had risen considerably. Owning imported wine became a visible symbol of wealth and successful trade with the empire. Archaeologists have uncovered Roman amphorae, fine drinking cups, and bronze wine vessels in elite Germanic graves. These discoveries reveal that tribal leaders welcomed luxury goods from the empire. A Roman goblet placed beside a respected chieftain in death was not merely decoration. It announced that its owner had connections reaching far beyond his homeland. Yet something interesting happened. Even as Roman wine arrived, beer never disappeared. For ordinary families, ale remained the drink of everyday life. The ingredients were local, familiar, and dependable. Every harvest produced new grain. Every household possessed the knowledge to brew, and every village had traditions passed from one generation to the next. Beer required no merchants crossing dangerous frontiers and no expensive imports from distant provinces. It belonged entirely to the people who made it. Roman writers often assumed that wine represented progress and refinement. They believed that as tribes came into closer contact with the empire, they would naturally abandon simpler customs in favour of Roman habits. History proved otherwise. Germanic societies eagerly adopted certain Roman technologies, weapons, jewellery, and manufactured goods, while continuing to brew the same ale their ancestors had enjoyed for centuries. The drinks themselves reflected two very different economies. Roman vineyards demanded permanent settlements, careful cultivation, skilled labour, storage facilities, and an extensive trade network capable of moving fragile cargo across the empire. Beer fit a more decentralised world. A farming household could produce its own supply, using grain harvested only a short walk from the front door. The entire process relied on local knowledge rather than imperial infrastructure. Climate also shaped these preferences. Northern Europe simply favoured grain over grapes, while small vineyards occasionally appeared in warmer frontier regions. The harsh winters beyond the Rhine made large-scale wine production unreliable. Nature itself encouraged brewing instead of winemaking. Over time, Roman soldiers stationed along the frontier began adapting as well. Supplies of wine were not always guaranteed, especially during difficult campaigns or harsh winters. Local beer became increasingly familiar to many garrisons. Some legionaries undoubtedly developed a taste for it, even if they preferred not to mention this fact while writing home to Italy. In the end, wine became a prestigious guest in Germania, welcomed on special occasions and admired for its distant origins. Beer, however, remained the trusted companion waiting by the hearth. One represented connection to the greatest empire of the age. The other represented family, harvest, and home. Neither drink erased the other. Instead, together they told the story of two cultures learning to understand one another without ever becoming exactly the same. Long before the first spear was thrown or the first shield locked into place, another ritual often unfolded inside the great hall. The fires burned brightly, roasted meat disappeared from wooden platters, and drinking horns passed steadily from hand to hand. To a Roman observer, it might have looked like the beginning of an unruly feast. To the Germanic tribes, however, these gatherings prepared warriors not only for combat, but also for the possibility that some of them would never return. Roman writers frequently remarked upon the courage of Germanic warriors. While they sometimes blamed ale for making these fighters reckless, the reality was more complex. Beer was not consumed simply to dull fear. It strengthened the bonds between men who would soon depend on one another for survival. A warrior rarely fought as an isolated individual. His reputation rested upon the loyalty of his companions and his devotion to his chieftain. Before a campaign, shared drinking reinforced those relationships. Every cup served as a reminder that each man stood beside brothers rather than strangers. When dawn arrived, those friendships would be tested beneath a rain of spears. Tacitus described the close relationship between a chief and his personal warband, known today by historians as the comitatus. Young warriors sought out respected leaders whose courage and generosity attracted followers. In return, the chief provided food, weapons, gifts, and hospitality. Ale flowed freely during these gatherings because generosity demonstrated strength. A leader who could not provide for his warriors was unlikely to keep them for long. The drinking itself followed customs that outsiders often misunderstood. Toasts honoured ancestors whose names still lived in song. Cups were raised to victories won by previous generations and to the gods believed to guide the fortunes of the tribe. Some gatherings likely included oaths, spoken aloud before witnesses, ensuring that promises carried the weight of the entire community. Roman officers were no strangers to military banquets themselves. Victorious generals celebrated with lavish dinners, and legionaries received extra rations after successful campaigns. Yet Roman discipline demanded that soldiers remain ready for orders at any moment. Germanic customs appeared far less restrained, leading Roman authors to conclude that the tribes allowed emotion to rule where Rome relied upon strict organisation. Modern historians suggest the difference was often exaggerated. While feasts could certainly become lively, no experienced chieftain wanted his finest warriors incapable of standing the following morning. A campaign required endurance as much as bravery. Excessive drunkenness before battle would have endangered everyone, and tribal leaders understood this perfectly well. Beer also played an important role after victory or defeat. Returning warriors gathered once again in the hall, this time celebrating survival or mourning those who had fallen. Songs preserved the memory of brave companions, ensuring their deeds would outlive them. The same cups that welcomed men before battle now honoured those who would never lift another. To the Romans, discipline was forged through endless drills, strict formations, and unwavering obedience. To the Germanic tribes, courage also grew around the communal table, where shared drink, shared stories, and shared promises transformed ordinary farmers into warriors, willing to stand together against one of history's greatest empires. For all their confidence, the Romans were remarkably practical people. They might joke that beer belonged to barbarians, but practicality had a habit of winning arguments that pride could not. Along the long frontier stretching from the Rhine to the Danube, Roman soldiers, merchants, and officials spent years living among Germanic communities. Eventually, many discovered that refusing the local drink was far more difficult than simply accepting another cup. A legionary stationed in northern Italy could expect regular shipments of wine from nearby vineyards. A legionary guarding a lonely fort deep along the Rhine faced a different reality. Supply wagons travelled enormous distances, roads became rivers of mud after heavy rain, and hostile raids could interrupt deliveries for weeks. Wine, once abundant, sometimes became a luxury. Beer, on the other hand, could be brewed almost anywhere grain was grown. Archaeological discovery suggests that Roman forts along the northern frontier were far from isolated outposts. Local traders regularly entered military settlements to sell food, livestock, leather, timber, and drink. Germanic ale became one of the many products exchanged between two societies that officially viewed each other with suspicion, but depended on commerce far more than either side cared to admit. Roman soldiers probably approached their first cup of ale with mixed expectations. The drink lacked the familiar sweetness and acidity of Mediterranean wine. It was thicker, often cloudy, and carried flavours of toasted grain, herbs, and sometimes a faint smokiness from the brewing fire. Some undoubtedly disliked it. Others likely discovered that after marching through cold rain for an entire day, the difference mattered far less than having something warm and filling to drink. Not every Roman considered beer completely foreign. Across the empire, people consumed grain-based beverages in regions where vineyards struggled to flourish. In Egypt, versions of beer had existed for thousands of years. In parts of Britain and Gaul, local brewing traditions were already well established before Roman conquest. The empire contained so many climates and cultures that even Roman citizens disagreed about what constituted the ideal drink. Merchants proved even less concerned with cultural pride. If Germanic tribes wanted Roman wine, merchants gladly sold it. If Roman garrisons developed a taste for local ale, merchants happily carried barrels instead of amphorae. Profit possessed an impressive ability to ignore philosophical debates about civilization. Some frontier settlements gradually blended customs from both worlds. Excavations have uncovered Roman pottery beside Germanic handmade ceramics, imported wine vessels alongside local drinking horns, and homes combining Roman building techniques with traditional northern designs. Beer and wine often appeared together at the same table, reflecting communities where cultural boundaries had become less rigid than official history suggested. According to the world of Asterix, there was just one tiny village in Gaul that stubbornly refused to bow before the mighty Roman Empire. Surrounded by Roman camps with wonderfully dramatic names, defended by fearless warriors, and protected by a druid's magical potion, it stood as the last pocket of freedom after Julius Caesar conquered the rest of the country. It is a charming idea, full of humour and impossible heroics. But behind the jokes lies a surprisingly fascinating historical question. Was there ever a village that truly held out against Rome? To answer that, we must travel back to the 1st century before Christ, when Julius Caesar launched one of the most ambitious military campaigns in Roman history. Between 58 and 50 before Christ, he led his legions across Gaul, a vast region that covered most of modern France, as well as parts of Belgium, Switzerland, Germany, and northern Italy. It was home to dozens of Celtic tribes, each with its own leaders, traditions, rivalries, and ambitions. Gaul was not a single nation waiting to be conquered. It was a patchwork of independent peoples who often spent as much time competing with one another as resisting outside enemies. This division became one of Caesar's greatest advantages. Some tribes fought him fiercely from the beginning, while others chose to negotiate, remain neutral, or even ally themselves with Rome against neighbouring rivals. Caesar understood that diplomacy could win battles just as effectively as swords. Every alliance he secured weakened the possibility of a united resistance. Still, conquest was anything but easy. The Gallic Wars lasted 8 exhausting years, forcing Roman armies to cross rivers, besiege enormous hill forts, march through dense forests, and survive harsh winters. Caesar's own writings describe fierce battles against determined opponents who knew the land far better than his soldiers. Whether every detail in his account is entirely trustworthy is another matter. After all, Caesar was writing not only as a general, but also as a politician eager to impress the people back in Rome. Victories tend to sound even more impressive when your own pen records them. The closest historical inspiration for Asterix's indomitable village came near the very end of the war. In 52 before Christ, many Gallic tribes finally united under the leadership of the Arvernian noble Vercingetorix. For perhaps the first time, much of Gaul fought together against Rome. It was a remarkable achievement, though it arrived rather late. The decisive struggle took place at the hill fort of Alesia. There, thousands of Gallic warriors held out behind powerful defences, while Caesar surrounded them with extraordinary siege work stretching for miles. Roman engineers built walls facing inward to trap the defenders, and another set facing outward to repel any relief army. It was an astonishing feat of military engineering. Unlike the cheerful comic adventures, the real story ended without a miraculous escape or a last-minute gulp of magic potion. Hunger, exhaustion, and overwhelming Roman organisation eventually forced Vercingetorix to surrender. Gaul became part of the Roman world. Yet the spirit that inspired Asterix was not invented. Across those long years of conquest, countless villages, tribes, and ordinary families resisted in ways both large and small. No single village remained forever unconquered, but the determination to preserve their independence was very real. The famous little village is therefore less a historical location than a symbol of every community that refused to surrender quietly, turning one of history's greatest conquests into a timeless story of courage, humour, and defiance. If there is one character who seems to hold the fate of the entire village in his hands, it is the druid Getafix. With a flowing white beard, a golden sickle, and a bubbling cauldron, he prepares the famous magic potion that transforms ordinary villagers into unstoppable champions capable of tossing Roman legionaries through the air like particularly surprised pigeons. It is one of the most memorable ideas in the series, yet it also raises an intriguing question. How much of Getafix is pure fantasy, and how much comes from the real druids of ancient Gaul? Surprisingly, far more than you might expect. The druids were among the most respected figures in Celtic society. Roman writers, especially Julius Caesar, described them as far more than priests. They served as judges, teachers, philosophers, healers, historians, and advisors to tribal leaders. In many communities, a druid possessed authority that rivaled even that of a chieftain. While warriors defended the tribe with swords, druids preserved its knowledge. Unlike Roman scholars, however, druids rarely wrote down their teachings. Caesar noted that they deliberately relied on memory rather than written texts. Students sometimes spent 20 years learning enormous quantities of poetry, law, genealogy, astronomy, religious traditions, and oral history before becoming full druids themselves. Imagine preparing for your final examination only to discover it covered 2 decades of lessons and absolutely no written notes. Suddenly, a short history quiz feels rather merciful, because so little was recorded by the druids themselves. Nearly everything we know comes from outsiders, especially Roman authors. This creates a problem. Roman writers admired the druids' intelligence, but also viewed them through the lens of conquest. Some accounts may be accurate, others exaggerated, and a few were probably designed to make the unfamiliar seem mysterious. What about the famous potion? There is no historical evidence that druids brewed a drink capable of granting superhuman strength. Archaeologists have uncovered no enchanted cauldrons, and Roman soldiers never reported watching a single Gaul lift an entire legionary camp with one hand. If such a recipe had existed, Caesar's conquest would almost certainly have taken much longer. That said, druids almost certainly prepared herbal remedies and medicinal mixtures. The Celtic world possessed an impressive understanding of local plants. Herbs were used to treat wounds, ease pain, reduce fevers, calm stomach illnesses, and assist healing after battle. Knowledge of forests, meadows, and rivers formed an essential part of a druid's education. To people who did not understand how these remedies worked, the effects could easily appear magical. One plant in particular became closely associated with the druids: mistletoe. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder described ceremonies in which druids harvested mistletoe growing on oak trees using a golden sickle. According to his account, the ritual was performed with great reverence because the plant was believed to possess sacred properties. Whether every detail is accurate remains debated, but the image proved unforgettable, and it clearly inspired the creators of Asterix. Getafix's golden sickle is almost certainly a playful nod to Pliny's description. The bubbling cauldron itself also has deep Celtic roots. Across Iron Age Europe, large bronze cauldrons symbolised abundance, hospitality, and ritual feasting. Some were magnificent works of craftsmanship, capable of serving entire gatherings. In Celtic mythology, magical cauldrons appeared again and again, promising endless food, wisdom, or even renewal. The comics simply combined these ancient legends with modern imagination. So while the magic potion belongs firmly in the world of fiction, the man stirring it does not. Behind Getafix stands the shadow of a real class of scholars whose wisdom shaped Celtic society for centuries. They may never have created invincible warriors, but they did preserve the beliefs, knowledge, and traditions of an entire civilization, an achievement that, in its own quiet way, was every bit as remarkable as magic. If you only knew the Gauls through Asterix, you might imagine every Celtic warrior charging into battle wearing enormous winged helmets, sporting an impressive moustache, and possessing enough strength to flatten an entire Roman cohort before lunchtime. While the comics exaggerate these features for laughs, they are not entirely disconnected from reality. Roman soldiers genuinely feared many of the warriors they encountered in Gaul, although not because they had recently sampled a druid's magic potion. The peoples of ancient Gaul were renowned fighters long before Julius Caesar arrived. Warfare played a central role in Celtic society, shaping alliances, politics, and reputation. A successful warrior gained prestige, wealth, and followers. Victory brought captured weapons, livestock, and sometimes even land. Defeat could mean the loss of everything. Roman writers often described the Gauls as physically imposing. Many tribesmen were taller than the average Roman legionary, partly because of genetics and partly because northern European diets were rich in dairy products, meat and grains. When these towering warriors appeared with brightly coloured clothing, decorated shields and long hair flowing behind them, they created an intimidating sight even before the battle began. The famous moustaches, however, were very real. Several Roman authors remarked that many Celtic men wore impressive facial hair while shaving their chins. Some moustaches were so large that ancient writers joked they dipped into drinking cups during meals. Whether this happened regularly is impossible to know, but one imagines it added an unexpected flavour to the ale. The helmets, on the other hand, deserve a closer look. Contrary to popular belief, most Celtic helmets did not have wings attached to them. Archaeological discoveries reveal beautifully crafted bronze and iron helmets, often decorated with crests, animal figures, or intricate patterns. But enormous wings would have been spectacularly impractical in combat. Running through a forest while wearing 2 large metal feathers on your head is an excellent way to discover every low tree branch personally. The Gauls also carried a remarkable variety of weapons. Their long iron swords impressed even Roman observers who admired Celtic metalworking. Spears remained common because they were effective and easier to produce than swords. Oval wooden shields reinforced with iron bosses provided protection, while wealthier warriors sometimes wore chainmail armour, a Celtic invention that Rome would eventually adopt on a massive scale. Perhaps the greatest difference between Roman and Gallic armies lay in organisation. Roman legionaries fought as highly disciplined units, drilling endlessly until movement became almost automatic. Commands were followed immediately, formations remained tight, and every soldier understood his role. Gallic armies operated differently. Warriors often fought with great personal courage and remarkable skill, but they usually belonged to separate tribes led by different chiefs. During large campaigns, coordinating these independent groups proved difficult. Individual bravery could not always compensate for a lack of unified command. Even so, the Romans never underestimated them. Caesar repeatedly praised the courage of his opponents, even while describing their eventual defeats. He knew that portraying the Gauls as formidable enemies made his own victories appear even greater. The creators of Asterix captured something essential about these warriors. Behind the comedy and exaggerated strength lies a genuine historical truth. The Gauls were fierce, proud, and deeply committed to defending their homeland. They may never have punched Roman soldiers into the nearest oak tree, but they fought with enough determination to force one of history's greatest military commanders into some of the hardest campaigns of his career. If there is one meal that appears almost as often as Roman legionaries flying through the air, it is the village banquet. Every adventure seems to end the same way. A long wooden table beneath the stars, laughter filling the air, and Obelix happily devouring an astonishing number of roasted wild boars. It has become one of the most recognizable images in European comics. But did the real Gauls truly spend every evening feasting on wild boar? Not quite. Wild boars certainly lived throughout the forests of ancient Gaul. They were powerful, aggressive animals capable of growing surprisingly large, with thick hides and dangerous tusks. Hunting one required courage, teamwork, and a healthy respect for the fact that the prey could easily decide to hunt back. Bringing down a boar was no simple task, making it a fitting symbol of bravery and skill. Because of this, wild boars held an important place in Celtic culture. They appeared on shields, helmets, coins, and military standards. Archaeologists have uncovered beautifully crafted boar figures decorating weapons and ceremonial objects across Iron Age Europe. To many Celtic peoples, the animal represented courage, strength, and ferocity, qualities every warrior hoped to possess. This symbolic importance explains why the creators of Asterix chose the boar as Obelix's favourite meal. It instantly connected the character with ancient Celtic traditions, while providing endless opportunities for comic exaggeration. After all, it is much funnier to watch someone carry an entire roasted boar under one arm than a basket of turnips. In reality, however, the average Gallic diet was far more varied. Archaeological excavations of Celtic settlements paint a different picture of daily meals. Most families relied heavily on agriculture rather than hunting. Barley, wheat, millet, oats, and rye formed the foundation of everyday life. These grains became bread, porridge, and hearty stews that provided reliable nourishment throughout the year. Livestock played an even greater role than wild game. Cattle represented wealth, while pigs, sheep, and goats supplied meat, milk, cheese, wool, and hides. Chickens and geese were also common. Hunting supplemented these resources but rarely replaced them. Wild deer, hares, birds, and occasionally boars appeared on the menu, especially during successful hunts or special celebrations. Fish also contributed to the diet. Rivers such as the Seine, Loire, Rhône, and Garonne teemed with fish, while coastal communities enjoyed shellfish and other seafood. Seasonal fruits, berries, hazelnuts, apples, herbs, and vegetables rounded out meals, creating a surprisingly balanced diet. Large communal feasts did occur, particularly after successful harvests, religious festivals, or important political gatherings. During these occasions, impressive quantities of meat were roasted over open fires, and beer flowed generously. A wild boar would have made a spectacular centerpiece for such an event, not because people ate one every day, but precisely because it was special. Roman writers occasionally commented on these banquets, describing generous hospitality and enormous portions served by tribal leaders. providing abundant food demonstrated power and prosperity. A chieftain who fed hundreds of guests earned admiration throughout the region. So why does Obelix eat boar in nearly every story? The answer is simple. The comics transformed an occasional luxury into a running joke. A food associated with bravery, celebration, and prestige became the favourite snack of history's strongest delivery man. In the end, the wild boar perfectly captures the spirit of Asterix. It begins with a genuine piece of Celtic history, adds a generous helping of imagination, and serves it with enough humour that readers remember both the joke and the history behind it. Throughout Asterix, Julius Caesar is impossible to miss. He is ambitious, proud, endlessly frustrated, and forever trying to conquer one infuriating little village that refuses to admit defeat. Sometimes he is portrayed as clever, sometimes spectacularly unlucky, but he always remains convinced that Rome should win. It makes for wonderful comedy. Yet the real Julius Caesar was every bit as fascinating as his fictional counterpart, though perhaps even better at shaping the story in his own favour. By the time Caesar marched into Gaul in 58 before Christ, he was already one of Rome's most talented politicians. He had served as a military commander, built powerful alliances, and understood something many generals never fully appreciated. Winning battles was only half the challenge. Convincing everyone back home that those victories made you indispensable was just as important. That is why Caesar wrote the Gallic War, his famous account of the conquest. At first glance, it reads almost like an objective military report. Caesar even refers to himself in the third person, writing, "Caesar did this rather than I did this," giving the impression of an impartial observer calmly recording events. It was a remarkably clever piece of political writing. The book described campaigns, battles, negotiations, and dramatic escapes in vivid detail. Roman readers followed the progress of the war almost as if receiving reports directly from the frontier. Every chapter reminded them that their general was overcoming enormous challenges against dangerous enemies. Modern historians appreciate the work because it provides invaluable information about the peoples of ancient Gaul. Without Caesar, we would know far less about Celtic tribes, their customs, their leaders, and the geography of the region. Yet historians also read his account with caution. After all, Caesar had every reason to present himself as the hero of the story. When battles were won, his leadership naturally received much of the credit. When setbacks occurred, difficult terrain, unpredictable weather, or unreliable allies often played convenient supporting roles. His enemies were described as fierce and courageous, which happened to make his own victories appear even more extraordinary. It was excellent military history, but it was also excellent self-promotion. The comic series gently pokes fun at this larger-than-life image. Its Caesar is brilliant enough to recognise talent, stubborn enough to keep trying, and vain enough to believe that one more plan will finally solve the problem. These exaggerated traits work because they are built upon qualities that the historical Caesar genuinely possessed. There is another important difference between the comics and history. In Asterix, Caesar spends an astonishing amount of time worrying about one tiny village. In reality, Gaul contained dozens of tribes, shifting alliances, and enormous campaigns stretching across thousands of miles. Caesar faced rebellions involving entire regions, not merely a handful of particularly energetic villagers with remarkable upper body strength. Perhaps the greatest example was Vercingetorix, the Arvernian leader who united many Gallic tribes in 52 before Christ. Unlike Asterix, Vercingetorix was very real, and for a time he posed the greatest threat Caesar had ever faced in Gaul. Their struggle culminated at Alesia, where Roman engineering, discipline, and relentless determination ultimately secured victory. Ironically, Caesar's greatest triumph also ensured that his version of events became the one future generations inherited. Because he survived to write the history, his voice echoed through the centuries louder than those of the people he conquered. The creators of Asterix understood this perfectly. By turning Caesar into both a formidable opponent and the frequent target of gentle satire, they remind us that history is often written by the winners, but it can still be joyfully questioned by storytellers. One of the greatest strengths of Asterix is that its famous village feels alive. There is the blacksmith hammering away in his workshop, the fishmonger proudly defending the freshness of his catch, the chief holding meetings from his shield, the druid gathering herbs, and neighbours who somehow manage to argue over almost everything except whether Rome should stay out. It is wonderfully exaggerated, but beneath the comedy lies a surprisingly accurate picture of what life in an Iron Age Gallic settlement may have looked like. The real villages of ancient Gaul were not random collections of huts scattered through the forest. Many were carefully planned communities built to suit the landscape. Some occupied open farmland, while others stood on hilltops protected by impressive earthworks and wooden walls. The largest fortified settlements, known today as oppida, could cover hundreds of acres and serve as political, economic and military centres for entire tribes. The little village in Asterix resembles a smaller rural settlement rather than one of these great strongholds. Archaeological excavations reveal clusters of timber houses built using wooden posts, woven branches and clay plaster. Roofs were usually thatched with straw or reeds, keeping families warm during the cold northern winters. While they may look simple from the outside, many homes were sturdy enough to last for years with regular maintenance. Life revolved around work. Before sunrise, farmers headed into nearby fields to tend barley, wheat, oats, and livestock. Blacksmiths repaired tools and forged weapons from iron, one of the Celtic world's greatest strengths. Potters shaped clay into cooking vessels, storage jars and drinking cups, while weavers transformed wool into colourful clothing using looms that stood inside family homes. Excavations have uncovered evidence that Gallic craftsmen were remarkably skilled. Their jewellery displayed intricate patterns, their swords were admired even by Roman soldiers, and their decorative metalwork often rivaled anything produced elsewhere in Europe. The comics exaggerate many things, but they are right to present the Gauls as talented artisans rather than simple forest dwellers. Trade also played a much larger role than people often imagine. Long before Caesar arrived, merchants carried goods across Europe. Salt, wine, amber, pottery, metals, and fine textiles moved between Celtic communities and the Mediterranean world. Some villages even imported luxury items from Roman territories decades before the conquest began. Rome and Gaul were trading partners long before they became enemies. Animals wandered freely through many settlements. Chickens scratched through the dirt, pigs searched for scraps, dogs guarded homes, and cattle represented a family's wealth. Unlike the comic, however, there was probably far less opportunity for someone to accidentally launch a fully armoured Roman into the nearest chicken coop. The village itself was only one part of the landscape. Sacred groves stood nearby. Rivers supplied water and fish. Forests provided timber and game, and open fields stretched beyond the houses. Every part of the environment contributed to daily survival. Nothing was wasted if it could be repaired, reused, or turned into something useful. Perhaps the most accurate feature of Asterix is not the buildings or even the clothing. It is the sense of community. Real Gallic villages depended upon cooperation. Harvesting crops, raising homes, defending the settlement, and surviving difficult winters required neighbours to rely on one another. They celebrated together, argued together, traded together, and faced danger together. The famous little village may exist only on the pages of a comic, but its spirit reflects a very real world, one where ordinary people built thriving communities long before Rome ever marched across their fields. If the world of Asterix has one element that feels especially magical, it is its religion. Druids wander through sacred forests collecting herbs, mysterious rituals take place beneath ancient oak trees, and everyone seems to accept that unseen powers are quietly watching over the village. While the comics replace much of this mystery with humour, the real religion of the ancient Celts remains one of the most fascinating and least understood belief systems in European history. The greatest challenge is surprisingly simple. The Celts left almost no written religious texts. Unlike the Romans, Greeks, or Egyptians, the Druids preferred to pass their knowledge from teacher to student through spoken tradition. Julius Caesar wrote that this was intentional. Writing sacred teachings down, he explained, might weaken memory and allow important knowledge to fall into the wrong hands. As a result, nearly everything historians know about Celtic religion comes from Roman writers, archaeological discoveries, and later Irish and Welsh myths written centuries after the Roman conquest. This means that studying Celtic religion is rather like assembling a large puzzle after discovering that half the pieces have disappeared and someone borrowed the picture on the box. Most people imagine a ninja preparing for a dangerous mission. They picture polished swords, hidden blades, smoke bombs, and black clothing blending into the night. It is an image made famous by centuries of stories, theatre, and modern films. Yet if you had followed a real shinobi setting out on an assignment in feudal Japan, you might have noticed something rather unexpected. Before checking his weapons, he would likely have paid just as much attention to his food. That may not sound particularly exciting. A pouch of travel rations rarely receives the same admiration as a gleaming sword. No child has ever dreamed of becoming the legendary master of carefully packed snacks. But history has a habit of rewarding practical people, and the shinobi were among the most practical individuals of their age. Unlike samurai, who often marched with armies supported by long supply lines, many shinobi operated alone or in very small groups. They travelled quietly across mountains, forests, villages, and enemy territory, sometimes covering remarkable distances on foot. Their missions demanded endurance rather than dramatic duels. A successful infiltration might require several days of careful observation before any action was taken. During that time, finding food could become just as important as avoiding enemy guards. A hungry shinobi was a distracted shinobi. A tired shinobi made mistakes. And a mistake inside an enemy castle usually ended the mission rather abruptly. This reality appears throughout genuine ninja manuals compiled during the early modern period. Famous works such as the Bansen Shukai, completed in the 17th century, and the Shoninki, written a few decades later, contain far more than lessons about espionage and disguise. They also include practical advice on survival, health, travel, and nutrition. Their authors understood that intelligence gathering depended upon keeping both body and mind functioning under difficult conditions. These manuals reveal a very different image of the ninja from the popular legend. Rather than relying on mysterious supernatural powers, historical shinobi depended upon preparation. They carefully selected lightweight foods that resisted spoilage, occupied little space, and provided steady energy over long journeys. Every item carried had to justify its weight. There was no room for unnecessary luxuries when climbing steep mountain paths or slipping unnoticed through hostile territory. The ideal ration had several important qualities. It needed to remain edible for weeks, survive changes in weather, and provide enough nourishment without requiring elaborate cooking. Strong smells were avoided whenever possible. A meal that announced your location to everyone downwind defeated the purpose of moving secretly through enemy lands. Many of these travel foods seem surprisingly familiar today. Dried grains, preserved fruits, nuts, sesame, honey, and concentrated energy-rich mixtures all appear in historical recipes. Modern hikers might recognize the same principles immediately. The packaging has changed, but the challenge remains identical. Carry as much nutrition as possible, while adding as little weight as possible. Traditional Japanese medicine also influenced these rations. Certain ingredients were believed not only to satisfy hunger, but also to improve stamina, sharpen concentration, aid digestion, and help the body resist illness during exhausting journeys. Whether every medicinal claim was accurate is another question, but the goal was clear. Food was expected to do much more than simply fill an empty stomach. The famous ninja therefore carried two kinds of equipment. One helped them survive a confrontation if everything went wrong. The other helped ensure they never reached that point in the first place. In the quiet world of espionage, a carefully prepared ration could be every bit as valuable as the sharpest blade, because the greatest victory was often returning home, without anyone ever realizing you had been there. Among the many curious recipes preserved in historical ninja manuals, none has attracted more attention than a small, unassuming food known as hardworking. At first glance, it hardly sounds impressive. It was not a magical pill that granted superhuman strength, nor a secret potion that made a shinobi invisible. It was simply a compact ball of concentrated nutrition, carefully designed to solve one very practical problem. How do you keep moving when there is no time to stop and cook? The name itself hints at its purpose. The word hyoro refers to military provisions or campaign rations, while gan means a pill or small ball. These were literally portable food balls, easy to carry and intended for long journeys. Far from being unique to shinobi, versions of concentrated travel food had existed in East Asia for centuries. What made the ninja manuals remarkable was the care with which they described recipes tailored specifically for covert operations. Different manuals record slightly different formulas, but many relied on familiar ingredients. Rice flour or glutinous rice often formed the base. Barley, buckwheat, or roasted grain flour might be added for additional nourishment. Powdered yam, known in Japan as yamimo, helped bind the mixture together while contributing carbohydrates that released energy gradually. Sesame seeds appeared frequently as well. Rich in oils, they provided valuable calories without taking up much space. Honey served two purposes at once. It acted as a natural preservative while also supplying quick energy for someone who had already spent hours climbing mountain paths or crossing forests. Licorice root sometimes found its way into the mixture, not simply for flavour, but because traditional medicine regarded it as beneficial for digestion and general health. The ingredients were kneaded together into a thick paste before being rolled into small balls roughly the size of large marbles. Once dried, they became surprisingly durable. Properly stored, they could survive weeks or even months without spoiling, making them ideal companions for lengthy missions. Unlike a full meal, hardworking was never intended to satisfy a large appetite. Historical instructions often recommended eating only 1 or 2 balls at a time, enough to restore strength without creating the heavy feeling that followed a large dinner. A shinobi needed to remain alert, quick, and ready to move. Feeling comfortably overfed was considered a disadvantage rather than a luxury. Modern nutrition experts looking at these recipes often recognize surprisingly sensible principles. The combination of carbohydrates, healthy fats, and natural sugars provides steady energy rather than a sudden burst followed by exhaustion. Although medieval Japanese practitioners did not speak in terms of calories or blood sugar, centuries of practical experience had led them toward remarkably effective travel food. Some later legends exaggerated the capabilities of hardworking. Popular stories occasionally claimed that a single ball could sustain a ninja for an entire day, or that a handful would eliminate hunger indefinitely. Such claims belong more to folklore than history. The human body still requires sufficient food, water, and rest, no matter how carefully a ration is prepared. Nevertheless, these small provisions reveal the true genius of the shinobi. Their greatest strength rarely came from spectacular weapons or impossible feats of acrobatics. It came from preparation. Every journey was planned, every tool chosen carefully, and every ounce of unnecessary weight eliminated. The humble hyarogan may not seem as dramatic as a sword hidden beneath a cloak, but for a shinobi travelling silently through enemy territory, it could mean the difference between completing the mission and turning back long before the destination ever came into view. If hyarogan provided steady nourishment for long journeys, another famous ration found in ninja manuals promised something equally valuable: the ability to keep going when proper meals were impossible. This food was known as suikatsugan, and over the centuries it gained an almost legendary reputation. Later stories claimed that a single pellet could eliminate hunger for days or give a shinobi endless stamina. As with many ninja legends, the truth is less magical, but perhaps even more impressive. Real missions rarely unfolded according to a convenient schedule. A shinobi might spend hours hidden inside tall grass overlooking a castle gate, waiting for a messenger to arrive. Another could remain concealed in the rafters of a warehouse until darkness fell. Others crossed remote mountain passes where villages were few, and stopping to prepare a meal would risk attracting unwanted attention. During these moments, hunger became more than an inconvenience. A growling stomach could break concentration. Fatigue slowed judgment. Even the simple act of searching for food increased the chance of being seen. The safest meal was often the one already tucked inside a travel pouch. Historical recipes for suikatsugan vary from one manuscript to another, but many shared a similar philosophy. Like hyarogan, they relied on ingredients that were lightweight, slow to spoil, and rich in energy. Rice flour frequently appeared alongside barley flour or roasted grains. Powdered yam remained a common ingredient because it stored well and mixed easily with other foods. Some formulas also included lotus seeds, soybeans, sesame, chestnuts, or medicinal herbs believed to strengthen the body during periods of exhaustion. Honey often acted as both a sweetener and a natural preservative, binding the ingredients into firm pellets that could survive long journeys without crumbling apart. The manuals rarely presented these recipes as miraculous. Instead, they emphasized careful preparation and moderation. A shinobi was instructed to eat small amounts at regular intervals rather than waiting until complete exhaustion. The goal was not to erase hunger entirely, but to prevent it from becoming overwhelming enough to interfere with the mission. Traditional Japanese medicine influenced many of these choices. Foods were selected not only because they supplied nourishment, but because they were believed to balance the body's internal energies. Ginger, for example, was valued for warming the body and aiding digestion. Licorice root was thought to harmonize the effects of other herbs. Certain ingredients were believed to reduce fatigue or improve circulation during long periods of physical effort. Whether every medicinal claim was scientifically accurate matters less than the practical thinking behind them. The shinobi understood that maintaining health during extended travel required more than simply eating large quantities of food. A traveller suffering from stomach illness, dehydration, or weakness would struggle to complete even the simplest assignment. Water presented another challenge. Many of these concentrated rations were intentionally dry to improve storage, meaning they were usually eaten alongside fresh water whenever possible. For this reason, knowledge of springs, streams, and safe drinking sources became an essential part of a shinobi's education. A pouch full of provisions meant very little without access to clean water. Modern hikers, soldiers, and endurance athletes still follow many of the same principles. Energy bars, trail mix, dehydrated meals, and compact emergency rations all serve the same purpose that suikatsugun once did. The ingredients may have changed, but the problem remains timeless: carrying enough food to stay strong without burdening yourself with unnecessary weight. The legendary ninja did not survive because they ignored hunger. They survived because they planned for it long before their journey ever began, turning something as ordinary as a carefully prepared ration into one of their most dependable tools. To modern readers, the recipes found in ninja manuals can seem unusual. A travel ration might include roasted grain, sesame, honey, powdered yam, and then, without warning, medicinal herbs more commonly associated with an apothecary than a kitchen. This was no accident. For the shinobi, food and medicine were never entirely separate. Every meal was expected to nourish the body while quietly helping it endure the demands of a dangerous life. This way of thinking reflected the medical traditions of Japan during the Sengoku and early Edo periods. Influenced by centuries of Chinese medicine, people believed that certain foods possessed qualities beyond simple nutrition. Some warmed the body, others cooled it. Some encouraged strength, while others were thought to improve circulation, calm the stomach, or restore energy after exhaustion. A shinobi, whose missions could involve days of walking through mountains, sleeping outdoors, and surviving on limited supplies, had every reason to pay attention to such knowledge. One ingredient that appears repeatedly is dried ginger. Today it is a familiar spice, but historically it was also considered valuable medicine. It was believed to warm the body during cold weather, stimulate digestion, and reduce nausea. Imagine spending an entire rainy night hiding in damp woodland with little opportunity to light a fire. A food containing ginger was about as close as you could come to carrying a little warmth in your pocket. Another common ingredient was licorice root, known in Japan as kanzo. Traditional physicians regarded it as a harmonizing herb that balanced other ingredients in medicinal formulas. It was also valued for soothing sore throats and supporting digestion. While modern science evaluates these claims carefully, there is little doubt that people of the period considered licorice one of the most dependable herbs available. Sesame seeds served both culinary and medicinal purposes. Rich in oils, they supplied concentrated energy while also storing well during long journeys. Their high-fat content made them especially valuable when fresh food became scarce. A handful of sesame contributed far more nourishment than its small size suggested. Japanese plums, particularly preserved ume, also played an important role. Salted and dried umeboshi were portable, resistant to spoilage, and widely believed to help prevent fatigue while encouraging appetite after long periods of exertion. Their intense sourness certainly guaranteed that anyone eating one would become fully awake rather quickly. Some manuals mention ginseng, though it remained an expensive ingredient reserved for wealthier households. Across East Asia, ginseng enjoyed an extraordinary reputation as a restorative plant, capable of supporting endurance and vitality. Whether every shinobi could afford it is doubtful, but its appearance in certain recipes reflects the high value placed upon maintaining physical resilience. Medicinal knowledge extended well beyond prepared rations. A trained shinobi needed to recognize useful plants growing naturally along mountain paths and forest edges. Wild herbs could treat minor wounds, reduce inflammation, or relieve digestive discomfort after drinking questionable water. This botanical knowledge was practical rather than mystical. A successful mission depended upon staying healthy, far from professional physicians. Even something as simple as tea carried practical value. Green tea was already widely consumed in Japan and contained natural caffeine that helped maintain alertness during long hours of observation. Combined with its ability to be transported in dried form, it became another useful companion for travellers. Modern readers sometimes expect ninja manuals to reveal exotic poisons or miraculous elixirs. Instead, they often present something far more believable: careful advice on preserving health. The greatest threat to many missions was not an enemy sword, but illness, exhaustion, or poor preparation. By treating every meal as an opportunity to strengthen the body, the shinobi increased their chances of returning home safely. Their secret, it turns out, was not hidden inside magical ingredients. It was hidden in the quiet understanding that survival often begins with taking care of yourself long before danger appears. No matter how carefully a shinobi prepared before leaving home, there was one problem that no amount of planning could completely solve. Supplies eventually ran out. A pouch full of hyarogan and suikatsugan could sustain a traveller for only so long before it became noticeably lighter. If a mission lasted longer than expected, the shinobi faced a challenge familiar to travellers throughout history: finding food without being found. Unlike armies that marched with wagons full of provisions, shinobi often travelled alone or in pairs. Stealing food from villages was dangerous. Purchasing supplies could attract unwanted attention, and hunting large animals created noise that could easily reveal a person's location. Survival depended instead on understanding the natural world. A well-trained shinobi viewed the landscape differently from an ordinary traveller. Where others saw an ordinary forest, the shinobi saw a pantry. Mountain paths offered edible ferns during the right season. Streams contained freshwater fish, small crabs, and shellfish. Chestnut trees, walnut groves, and stands of bamboo each provided valuable food at different times of the year. Even seemingly empty fields could hide edible roots and wild vegetables beneath the soil. This knowledge was not unique to ninjas. Farmers, woodcutters, monks, and hunters throughout Japan possessed similar skills. What made the shinobi different was the necessity of applying this knowledge quietly and efficiently while remaining unnoticed. Mushrooms presented both opportunity and danger. Japan's forests contained many delicious edible varieties, but they also sheltered poisonous species capable of causing severe illness or death. A shinobi operating far from help could not afford such a mistake. Ninja manuals therefore encouraged careful observation and practical experience rather than reckless confidence. It was far better to remain slightly hungry than confidently eat the wrong mushroom exactly once. Wild plants also changed with the seasons. Spring offered fresh shoots and tender greens, rich in nutrients after the long winter. Summer produced berries and herbs. Autumn filled forests with nuts, chestnuts, and mushrooms. Winter, by contrast, demanded careful planning because edible plants became far more difficult to find. Seasonal knowledge therefore became just as valuable as knowledge of geography. Fishing often proved more reliable than hunting. Small woven traps could be placed quietly in streams before sunset and checked later under cover of darkness. Hooks and lines occupied almost no space inside a travel pouch, making them practical tools for extended journeys. A single fish, roasted quickly over a carefully managed fire, provided valuable protein without requiring the effort needed to pursue larger game. Even insects occasionally appeared on the menu. While modern diners may hesitate, many insects are rich in protein and were traditionally eaten in various parts of Japan. Grasshoppers, for example, have long been consumed after being cooked and seasoned. A hungry traveller concerned with survival was generally less interested in elegance than in nourishment. Water deserved equal attention. Drinking directly from stagnant ponds invited illness, while fast-moving mountain streams usually offered cleaner sources. Experienced travellers learned to recognise reliable springs and avoided water contaminated by villagers or livestock upstream. Dehydration could weaken a shinobi long before hunger became a serious problem. Perhaps the greatest lesson hidden within these survival techniques is that the shinobi sought cooperation with nature rather than domination over it. They did not attempt to conquer the wilderness. They studied it patiently, learned its rhythms, and accepted its limits. In the end, the forests of Japan became more than hiding places. They became trusted companions, quietly providing food, water, and shelter to those observant enough to understand the generous secrets hidden beneath every tree, beside every stream, and beneath every fallen leaf. Finding food was only half the challenge for a shinobi. The other half was preparing it without anyone realizing you were there. A hungry traveller could always build a large fire, roast a meal, and enjoy the warmth, but a column of smoke rising above the trees was also a remarkably effective way of announcing your exact location to every patrol within several miles. For someone whose profession depended on remaining invisible, that was less than ideal. Historical ninja manuals repeatedly emphasize one simple principle: avoid attracting attention whenever possible. That advice extended far beyond disguises and secret routes. It shaped the way a shinobi ate, drank, rested, and even cooked. Whenever practical, food was chosen specifically because it required little or no preparation. The famous hyarogan and suikatsugan could be eaten immediately without lighting a fire. Dried rice, roasted grains, preserved plums, nuts, and dried fish all shared the same advantage. They were ready to eat, produced no smoke, and left almost no trace behind. Cooking, however, could not always be avoided. During long missions, warm food restored strength and improved morale, especially after days spent travelling through cold mountains or wet forests. The challenge was to prepare it as discreetly as possible. Instead of building large campfires, experienced travellers preferred very small fires that burned efficiently while producing minimal smoke. Dry hardwood was valued because it burned cleaner than damp branches lying on the forest floor. Fresh wood contained moisture that created thick clouds of smoke, the last thing a hidden operative wanted drifting above the trees. Location mattered just as much as fuel.